Let's start with a question. What does a government look like when it's running out of answers? Because what we're witnessing right now, from the Persian Gulf to the Caribbean, is an administration that staked its entire identity on being different from its predecessors and is now quietly doing everything those predecessors did, only faster, louder, and with far less accountability. And today we're going to walk through exactly what's happening piece by piece, because the full picture is something most people aren't putting together yet. Start with this. The United States Navy has officially confirmed that it lost a $240 million drone, not misplaced, not temporarily out of contact, lost, gone. A $240 million piece of military hardware, the MQ-4C Triton, a high-altitude surveillance drone built by Northrop Grumman, vanished somewhere over the Persian Gulf on April 9th. The Navy's own mishap report listed it as a Class A incident, which means the damage exceeded $2 million. $2 million is the minimum threshold. The actual loss here is obviously roughly 120 times that figure. The location of the crash was officially withheld. Now let's just sit with that number for a second. $240 million. The drone had taken off from Naval Air Station Sigonella in Italy before it disappeared from tracking software while operating over the Gulf. Business Insider reported that the aircraft simply went dark. No explosion, no confirmed enemy fire acknowledged publicly, just silence where $250 million used to be. The war zone was the first outlet to flag that the Navy's internal reporting had confirmed the loss. And while the military hasn't made a formal connection between that specific drone and the one listed in the mishap report, the timing and geography make it difficult to see them as unrelated. Here's what matters beyond the dollar figure. This is the first time an MQ-4C Triton has been confirmed lost since the platform entered active service in 2018. These aircraft aren't cheap replacements you order and receive in 6 weeks. They represent years of development, specialized intelligence capabilities, and logistical infrastructure. And this isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening as the financial costs of the current campaign in the region are already, by most estimates, running into the tens of billions of dollars when you account for munitions, operational costs, extended deployments, and the downstream economic ripple effects. And that's what we have to be honest about when we talk about these wars. The price is never just the price tag on the weapon. It's the ongoing maintenance, the replacement cycles, the personnel costs, the diplomatic fallout, the intelligence gaps created when assets go down. You lose a surveillance drone that's sophisticated, and you're not just out $240 million. You're out the intelligence it was gathering, the operational visibility it provided, and the deterrence its presence created. These things compound. They don't cancel out. Compare that to what the same resources could mean domestically. This isn't a partisan exercise, it's just arithmetic. Critics have noted that the total expenditure already sunk into this conflict would fund years of public education programs, infrastructure repair, or social services. When politicians on any side argue about the cost of modest domestic investments, the honest question the public should be demanding is, compared to what? Because the scale of what we spend fighting undeclared wars in far-off regions tends to make every domestic expense look negligible by comparison, and yet those domestic expenses are always the ones that get called unaffordable. The drone story matters for another reason, too. It reinforces a pattern of opaque accountability around this conflict. The Navy withheld the location of the crash. It took independent reporting to surface the mishap classification. The public found out about a $240 million loss, not through any official announcement, but through a defense publication reading military aviation records. That's not transparency. That's damage control dressed up as disclosure. And it brings us to the figure who sits at the center of a lot of these accountability questions right now, Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Because while the drone story was unfolding, Congresswoman Yasamin Ansari of Virginia filed formal articles of impeachment against him. And the reasons she cited go well beyond the bureaucratic or the procedural. Her case rests on 3 distinct pillars. The first is what became known as Signalgate, the disclosure that Hegseth was sharing sensitive, potentially classified operational information through unsecured commercial messaging applications, the kind of security lapse that would end the career of virtually any other official at any other level of government. The second involves what she described as double tap strikes on vessels in the Caribbean, a military tactic where a second strike is conducted in the immediate aftermath of the first, specifically to target first responders, which is a recognized violation of international humanitarian law. The third, and the one she described most pointedly, concerns an airstrike in Iran that she alleges killed over 160 children at a school. That last allegation is the most severe. And she did not mince her language. She used the phrase war crimes. She stated that Hegseth violated his constitutional oath. She was direct in a way that almost no elected official ever is when it comes to military conduct. And the reaction from her Democratic colleagues was notably quick. So within a short period of filing, she had secured more than 10 co-sponsors. Now, you can agree or disagree with the tactical and legal assessments here, but what you cannot do credibly is dismiss the significance of a sitting member of Congress formally alleging that the Secretary of Defense committed war crimes and filing impeachment articles on that basis. That's not a fringe political move. That's the constitutional accountability mechanism functioning as designed, and it deserves to be taken seriously, not treated as political theater. What makes Hegseth's position particularly precarious right now is the combination of pressures converging on him simultaneously. There are the impeachment articles. There are the ongoing questions about the signal scandal that never fully resolved. There is the general perception, reinforced repeatedly by his press conference performances and his congressional testimony record, that he is not commanding the professional confidence of the institution he leads. Defense secretaries are supposed to project authority and precision. When those qualities aren't visible, it creates problems, not just politically, but operationally, because the people under you notice, and so do the adversaries watching. And here's where things take a turn that should alarm anyone paying close attention. Because when a political figure is embattled, when they are facing consequences and losing ground, the temptation is always to manufacture a moment that resets the narrative, to create a situation dramatic enough, consequential enough, that the previous failures get crowded out by new urgency. And what we are now seeing, according to reporting from USA Today and others, is that the Pentagon is quietly ramping up planning for a possible military operation in Cuba. Let that land. Cuba. The United States military is preparing contingency options for an intervention in Cuba. Two sources with direct knowledge, speaking to USA Today on condition of anonymity because they were not authorized to discuss the matter publicly, confirmed that planning is actively underway. This is not a war game. This is not a think tank exercise. This is the United States military building operational plans for a possible intervention in a neighboring country in the Western Hemisphere at the direction of a civilian leadership structure that is under significant political duress. The escalation toward Cuba began in January when the Trump administration moved to cut off oil shipments to the island as part of a broader campaign to force political change on the communist-led government. That was the opening pressure. What followed were intermittent diplomatic signals. USA Today had previously reported in March that the two sides were actually in early stage discussions that some described as potentially historic. A possible economic deal, quiet back-channel engagement, the kind of incremental diplomacy that doesn't make for dramatic television, but occasionally produces real outcomes. That path now appears to be narrowing, if not closed entirely. The Pentagon planning that's been confirmed runs in direct opposition to the spirit of dialogue. You don't build military intervention options for a country you're earnestly negotiating with. The two tracks are not parallel, they're contradictory. And when one side is simultaneously talking and preparing to fight, you have to ask what the talking is actually for. The Cuba situation also doesn't exist in isolation. The administration has been simultaneously escalating rhetoric around Venezuela, with the president making statements that suggest the United States claims effective dominion over the natural resources of a sovereign nation. That's not diplomatic leverage. That's imperial assertion. And it follows a pattern that has been building since the beginning of this term, the annexation framing around Canada, the Greenland discussion, the posture toward Panama. These aren't random statements. They are a consistent signal about how this administration views the United States' relationship to the rest of the hemisphere as a landlord, not a neighbor. And none of this lines up with what was promised. We were told repeatedly and emphatically that this was an America First foreign policy, one that rejected the interventionist neoconservative framework that characterized prior administrations. We were told the era of nation building and endless military campaigns was over. We were told that the professionals who cheered on the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and the Afghanistan occupation would have no seat at this table. That promise has been broken so thoroughly that at this point, continuing to invoke it almost feels like mockery. What we have instead is an administration pursuing military action in the Middle East, preparing for intervention in the Caribbean, threatening sovereign nations over their natural resources, and watching its defense secretary face impeachment for alleged war crimes. The neoconservative architecture they claim to oppose is running on new hardware with new faces and the same fundamental logic that American military power is a tool to be deployed in service of interests that are never quite fully disclosed to the public. And the interests are worth examining directly, because one of the things that got almost no mainstream coverage was the disclosure that Hegseth's financial advisor, acting on his behalf, had attempted to purchase approximately $2.5 million in defense sector exchange traded funds in the period shortly before the administration escalated its military campaign in Iran. Defense ETFs are investment products that track the performance of companies in the defense industry. When wars happen, those companies do well. When wars end, they do less well. The timing of that attempted purchase raises questions that have not been adequately answered in any public forum, and the transaction was ultimately blocked. TD, but the intent to make it was real and documented. Wall Street's reaction to the current military campaigns has been instructive as well. Despite the volatility that geopolitical escalation typically introduces into markets, major financial institutions have reported periods of record trading revenue during the same time frame. JP Morgan and others have logged exceptional performance, specifically in trading divisions, precisely during periods when the market was whipsawing on the back of policy announcements and military developments. The instability itself becomes the profit opportunity for those with the analytical resources, the connections, and frankly, the advanced information to position accordingly. For everyone else, the volatility is just loss and anxiety. This is the architecture of how these decisions actually work at the structural level. They are not made purely from strategic analysis of national interest. They are made within a web of financial incentives, legacy relationships, political survival calculations, and personal ambitions. That doesn't mean every official is consciously corrupt in every decision. It means the system produces decisions that predictably benefit certain actors, and those actors have strong incentives to keep the system producing those decisions. Against that backdrop, what Senator Chris Murphy did in a recent committee exchange takes on added significance. Murphy pressed Michael Waltz, Trump's UN ambassador, and notably the same official at the center of the Signalgate controversy, on the explicit threat Trump made to, in the president's own words, end Iran's civilization if negotiations failed. Murphy's line of questioning was sharp and uncomfortable, and Waltz's response was revealing. Waltz attempted to contextualize the president's statement by pointing to Iran's alleged practice of commingling civilian and military infrastructure, the argument that power plants, bridges, and civilian facilities are potentially dual use and therefore legitimate targets. He noted the IRGC's economic footprint. He cited the Iranian government's history of violence against its own citizens and against Americans. These are real facts about a real adversary. But Murphy's follow-up was the right one. Does any of that actually justify a presidential threat to end an entire civilization? Is threatening mass civilian casualties an appropriate tool of American statecraft regardless of the adversary? Waltz's eventual answer was essentially it was tough talk, and it worked because negotiations resumed shortly afterward. And that framing reveals the underlying logic in a way that should give everyone pause. The argument is that threatening to commit what international law would classify as crimes against humanity is a valid negotiating technique because it produces results. By that standard, anything that produces results is justified. That is not a principle. That is the absence of one. And it's worth noting, as Murphy pointed out, that the negotiations Waltz cited as proof of the strategy's success remain fragile and unresolved. The ceasefire he referenced came and went. The underlying tensions have not been resolved. The threat produced a temporary pause, not a solution. None of these threads, like the lost drone, the impeachment, the Cuba planning, the Venezuela posture, the market manipulation, the threat of civilizational destruction as a negotiating chip, none of them are separate stories. They are the same story. They are the story of an administration that overextended itself, promised things it could not deliver, and is now escalating in every direction simultaneously to avoid the political cost of admitting that the strategy isn't working. Every war has a moment when the people running it know privately that the original plan is no longer viable. What they do in that moment defines everything. The wise move is to adapt, recalibrate, and build toward an honest accounting of what went wrong. The dangerous move is to expand, to open new fronts, raise the rhetorical stakes, and hope that the volume of activity drowns out the signal that something has gone fundamentally off course. Or we are watching that dangerous move being made in real time with real resources affecting real people. The sailors and soldiers being deployed, the civilians in target zones, and the taxpayers funding the whole enterprise without being fully told what it's for. Senator Murphy's challenge in that hearing room matters because it represents exactly what the moment requires: a refusal to accept the reframing, a refusal to let "it was tough talk" serve as absolution for statements that, if acted upon, would constitute some of the gravest violations of international law imaginable, a refusal to normalize the idea that threatening mass death is just a negotiating technique. Congresswoman Ansari's impeachment filing matters for the same reason. Not because impeachment will necessarily succeed. The arithmetic of the current Congress makes a conviction extraordinarily unlikely, but because the act of putting those articles on the record, of naming what allegedly happened and requiring a formal response, creates accountability that would otherwise not exist at all. It forces the question. It puts the facts into the official record. And it signals to anyone watching that there are still people in the system who believe the rules apply to everyone, including the people at the very top. The fight over the direction of this country, over whether it will continue down this path of expansion, militarism, and opaque decision-making, or whether it will correct course towards something that actually serves the people paying for it, that fight is not over. It is loud, it is is consequential and it is absolutely worth paying attention to. Because if you are not watching this closely, if you are not asking the hard questions about where the money goes, who benefits, and at whose expense these decisions are made, then the decisions will continue to be made in the way they are currently being made by people who are counting on your distraction to insulate them from accountability. Don't give them that comfort.